Tristan, would you tell us the sort of work that you're involved with, Dr. Tristan?
Hello Marion, my name is Tristan de Chalain. I am a craniofacial plastic surgeon, primarily doing paediatric plastic surgery for children with cleft lips and palates and various craniofacial anomalies. I work in both the public sector and the private sector.
And hi Teresa.
Yeah, hi Miriam. Well, I'm, as you know, I'm a West Auckland midwife, and I've been a midwife for 17 years and 12 years working in private practice, you know, caring for women right through their pregnancy and the birth, and ongoingly for 4 to 6 weeks after the babies have been born.
Right. I'd like to explore some of the problems that perhaps you've both come across in your fields of work, particularly in relation, first of all, to flat heads or deformed heads in some cases. Are you able to tell us
Sure.
some of your concerns that you've seen?
I think it was the Dutch in Europe who were the first to advocate for what was called a back to sleep campaign, but it was when the American Academy of Pediatrics started pushing the line that back to sleep was best, that we started to see a major shift in people's practices, and children more and more came to be slept in the supine position. If you look at the statistics, it was from about 93, 94 that we started seeing a dramatic rise in the number of children presenting to craniofacial centres with deformed heads, or what we call positional plagiocephaly, from the Greek plagio, meaning oblique or skewed head.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of a child's head in the first few days and weeks of life as being as soft as a little bag of water, just as you put a bag of water on a hard surface, it will flatten the surface in contact with that bag. Just so can a child's head deform under the simple pressure of the skull on a firm mattress. Obviously the problem is compounded in a preemie.
Right. That seems to be fairly widely known now that can happen, but it also seems that the advice that parents are being given is that it isn't really a problem because the heads mostly come right. And I believe, in my experience, what I'm seeing is that people believe then that their baby's head will come right and they don't need to worry. Is that a fair assumption for parents to have?
I think that over the last 10 years the main accent has been on getting people to adopt the sleeping baby on the back message.
Mm-hmm.
With that in mind, there has been a relative dismissal of the side effect of sometimes causing a depression or a flat-headedness in a proportion of those babies. And statistics from research done in this town would indicate that that could be as high as 30 or 40% of children may develop a flat head.
Okay.
Certainly in my experience as a craniofacial surgeon, the message that of those children who get a flat head, they'll all come right, or the vast majority will come right, is perhaps to be taken with a grain of salt. We think that probably 10 to 20% of those children are left with a residual, albeit not as severe, deformation of the head, usually of the occipital part, the back of the head.
And then I've been quoted, well, does that matter if your baby has a strange shaped head, because at least they'll be alive?
The error in that reasoning is that every child who is not slept on their back is going to die, which I don't believe is true. Cot death is certainly a frequent cause of childhood illness, but it is still pretty rare. And while I firmly applaud the work that's been done in changing the statistics and preventing cot death, I do want us to be aware that it is simple to introduce measures to comply with sleeping a baby on its back, but at the same time to help prevent, or at least nip in the bud, developing flat-headedness.
Yeah, they're doing some good work with that, aren't they?
Yes.
Teresa, what do you teach in your classes? Do you?
We do, as midwives, teach women that the safest sleep position is to position the baby on the back. And we also teach mums, though, about the issue of the flattened head syndrome. And the recommendations are you sleep your baby on their back and that you alternate the head position from side to side with alternate feeds, and be aware of having interesting things on both sides of the crib for the baby to look both ways. Being aware that babies favour turning to the light, so if your baby is always slept with its head at the same end of the crib, it will favour turning to the window, to the light, and therefore you need to alter the baby's putting its head this end or that end, varying that position. Now, the issue is that in spite of doing all those things, there will still be some babies that in spite of all of that will still start favouring turning their head to one side. Actually, two things can happen. The head can flatten fairly evenly at the centre at the back, but more disturbingly, some babies will turn their head persistently to one side, and then the head flattens very unevenly and can give a very distorted head shape.
Okay, and then you're a young mum and you've been told, look dear, don't worry, it's going to come right.
Well, I don't think that that's actually true, and Tristan has certainly borne that out. He sees the babies much later than we're seeing them. And then certainly as a parent, I would want two things. I'd want my baby to sleep safely and to have a normal head shape, and I do think that that's completely possible. So when out in the community I see a baby that at 3 and 4 weeks, it's already obvious that the head is flattening, particularly if it's favouring turning to one side, then we need to talk with parents, and they need to know that it isn't necessarily going to come right in the child's head.
Despite all those interventions of following the light and the mobiles and the turning the cot around and all of that. So
then in all fairness to the parents, we need to say to them that they do have an alternative that has the baby both be sleep safely and not end up with a funny head shape.
Right.
And so at that point, I normally would talk with them about the option of how they can side sleep their baby as one of the options for sleeping position and do that safely.
Okay.
And the cot death research does suggest that side sleeping is riskier than back sleeping, primarily because those babies unrestrained can then get onto their tummies, and that's a very unsafe sleeping position.
Yes, and that's the only reason that I'm aware of, and looking at the SIDS website, that the only reason why it is risky is because the baby is more likely to go from the side to the tummy than from the back to the tummy. So in that way, I suppose it's a good point to ask you both of the experience that you may have had and the awareness that you have of the Safety Sleep Rep. Is I know that you have been involved with coordinating the hospital clinical trials. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
In the craniofacial clinic, we were confronted with the problem of a number of children coming through who've been referred by GPs, midwives, blanket nurses, with the problem of a deformed or flattened head. And often our main interest would be to rule out more significant problems such as craniosynostosis or fusion of skull sutures. Once that's been ruled out, and once you've seen a few of these children, you can pick them at a glance. You need to be able to offer the parents some way of treating it, because clearly surgery isn't what you need to be doing for the vast majority of these.
What about helmets?
So there are a number of conservative measures for treating these children's deformed heads. There are things like the various moulding bands that you can put around a head. You can use a firm moulding helmet which provides a fairly tight fit over the prominent areas and allows space over the flattened areas. So as the skull continues to grow, it restrains growth over the high points and allows the skull to grow into the hollowed areas which are over the flat parts. The trouble is the compliance with wearing these helmets is low because they're uncomfortable, they don't fit fantastically well, and children don't enjoy headgear very much. So what we wanted to do was to find a way of being able to position a child safely such that it did not lie on the flat spot, but at the same time couldn't roll onto its stomach. So in other words, we wanted a sleeping position which was safe in terms of cot death, but would provide for keeping pressure off the flat spot and allowing room for growth, because the child will correct its own skull shape, particularly during the first year of life when that head is growing very rapidly, driven by the rapidly growing brain. And somebody mentioned a device called the Safety Sleep. Now, working in a public hospital clinic, before we could recommend it, we wanted to be sure that it was safe to use. So long before we started saying this is what we need to use to correct flat heads, we did a trial to see whether or not it was a safe device for the average parent to use in their home. And we introduced a number of them into the hospital, in the neonatal and pediatric wards, where children who had been admitted to hospital for other reasons, and that ranged from pneumonitis to various infectious illnesses, they were in hospital for at least a night or 2 or 3, were put into these safety sleeps as part of a prospective trial. And we found that in about 93, I think it was, 93 or 4% of cases, there was no particular problem with the safety sleep. There was never a risk to the child. So we found the device would restrain the child in comparing head position to what you'd put the child down in and then reviewed it a few hours later, and in comparing body position. Obviously the body position was better controlled, but even in the older children the head position was reasonably well controlled. So here we had a device which was available off the shelf at a reasonable price to parents, which would offer them the peace of mind of having safety, but also being useful in trying to reshape the infant's head in the most natural way.
Right.
And since that time, which was a good 4 or 5 years ago now, we've been recommending the device to parents coming through the craniofacial clinic who present with an otherwise uncomplicated flat head.
Right. And in your experience, those flat heads would not have come right by themselves, obviously.
If the child, or if the family had been able to keep the child from lying on the flat spot, yes, they would have come right.
Okay.
But it's not possible to do that without some form of restraint.
Yeah. And that's your experience too, isn't it?
Yes. Even at 3 to 4 weeks, some babies have already quite clearly established a favoured sleeping position.
And there's no doubt the earlier you can catch these children, the easier it is to correct the head shape deformation.
Do you want to just pick that up for a second, Teresa, and just perhaps, if you actually chose to use a safety sleep yourself, didn't you?
Yes, I did with my youngest child.
Right.
And the reason I started using it is that I was sleeping Alice on her back, as we're recommended to do. She was quite a fretful baby, so those early months weren't particularly easy. And when she was about 4.5 months old, she mastered rolling over onto her tummy, and from the time she could do it, that's what she did. And she was much more, she definitely was much more comfortable lying on her tummy. There were 2 problems with that. One, I was really anxious from the cot death perspective that she was now sleeping in the position everyone's told not to sleep a baby in. And the other was that she then started to creep, and she would creep around the bed and started waking up 5-6 times a night, wedged up against the side of the cot.
And I suppose you're aware of positional asphyxia as well.
Yes, I was really concerned about that from that point of view. And so it was really a sort of desperation thing that I went and, by the time you're being woken 5-6 times a night to a 4 or 5-month-old baby, I was very desperate to solve the situation. So I went and bought the safety sleep, and it was really, really effective. She stopped waking so often. She was sleeping. I either put her on her back or put her on her side, and she was much more settled. And I felt confident and safe from the perspective of that she was no longer on her tummy, sleeping on her tummy with the cot death risk. But it absolutely solved the creeping around the bed thing and ending up jammed up against the bars and waking, crying because she was uncomfortable.
And are you aware of that stage as well, the next stage when they're standing and climbing and falling? Yes. 1 in 5 0 to 2-year-olds that are hospitalised.
Yes, so that's obviously and the other thing about Alice is that once she was familiar in sleeping in it, that's what she associated with being snug. So, that was associated with being snug, and she was very happy and settled. I felt confident from that point of view that you've just mentioned, that she wasn't going to be, at risk of falling or tumbling. I found it really useful when we travelled, that even though we were in a different environment, I'd get out the safety sleep and put it wherever we were, and on whatever cot or single bed when you're somewhere travelling and you haven't got access to a cot.
We've actually now made them for double beds as well, simply because there are always going to be a number of people who choose to sleep with their babies for whatever reason, and it means that the large one, if you can imagine the new one that we've made on a double bed, the centrepiece that wraps around the baby goes to the outside of the bed. The bed often gets pushed into against the wall. The two parents are sleeping next to one another.
Right.
And the baby's quite safe there in its own little environment.
Yes.
And it can't creep down into the bed, which often happens.
Yes.
When we're talking to people, we mention the no smoking and obesity and drugs and alcohol, and that bed sharing isn't generally recommended in our culture, but it seems that we're one of the few cultures that don't sleep with our babies.
Well, nothing stays the same, Miriam, because the advice around promoting breastfeeding now includes being willing to bed share with all that recommendation that you've just mentioned. So it's actually getting...
then you can imagine the baby's head naturally turning your way, can't you?
Yes.
Yeah, so all the different sizes, I suppose we should just talk about for a second. And if you just place that baby on the back for a moment, because you said you placed yours on the back.
Sometimes on the back, and but also on the side. Yeah.
The only reason why we've actually made that and brought along the little head wedge to show for this interview is because of the fact that so many babies are now being asked to sleep on their back, and parents are quite anxious not to do it because they're being told by experts to do that. And we found that if we tuck the little head wedge in underneath the top end of the safety sleep, and the baby's head goes to the side.
Oh, I see. Yes.
This is a very attached head, this one. And so at one sleep you would do that, and then the next sleep it would go on that side. And also it will remind the mother what side she put the head on last. And we're having some very good feedback. The doll's a bit stiff, but the real baby works quite well. But I think the beauty of the hospital clinical trials, as you were talking about, and your own gut feeling that you preferred the side most of the time, is something that people can safely do now.
Yes.
With this very, very simple device that's been completely tested, fabric tested as well, and nice and cool. Did you use it for a long time with your baby?
Through that first year of life, yes.
Because my boys were about 2.5, and my daughter, I was 3.5. I had to pretend it was in the wash. But if it's brought in a philosophy of positive, nurturing, trust-building parenting, which we really support, so the last thing that you lovingly wrap around a wee baby that you've already done all the nice settling skills for, and then you know how your body's sort of relaxed.
Associated it with that, you know, the ritual of being snuggled down and sleepy time.
And then as soon as you hear them wake, that's your cue to just in a relaxed way go and attend to them. And I think you build trust. And my 3.5-year-old daughter used to lie in the bed and she'd grab it herself and put it on. I honestly did think that she would have it till she was 21. Then for a while I pretended it was in the wash, told her it was still wet. But,
one of my friends used one right through right through to 2 plus 2.5. She had twins, and her son was quite a placid child, and reliably went down for sleep beautifully every day. And her little daughter was an absolute little human dynamo, and you could hardly get her to sit still, lie still long enough to actually fall asleep. And she used it very effectively right through toddlerhood to get her daughter to settle well enough to just take time to relax enough to actually go off to sleep for a daytime sleep. Very effective. Do either of you know very much about the reflux? It seems to be that lots of babies have reflux now, and where they need to be put on an angle, and those babies are often being asked to be put on their back as well. It's about a 45-degree angle, isn't it? It's actually about the angle I've got this baby at. I feel very confident about using a safety sleep for a baby with reflux for a variety of reasons. One is that the angle means there's more potential for your baby to slide down the bed, and I know that the advice is you position your baby with the feet at the bottom of the bed, but babies' legs bend beautifully, so they still can slide some more anyway. And if you're using the safety sleep wrap, it actually isn't possible for your baby to do that. So from that point of view, I think that's a safety issue. And it means that you could also confidently sleep the baby with reflux on its side, which...
The left side, I believe, from a Plunkett paediatrician, because of the way the tummy valves are. Yes, they're often more comfortable.
Yes, they're more. The babies, they're often fretful babies, and if they settle better, on their side.
We have made a special reflux one now, which people can see on the website. It has a special piece that comes up in between the two flaps. Just gives extra support for those babies that are on that angle. And then we also advocate that they can roll up a towel or a pillow at the feet to keep the knees bent up a little bit, which takes pressure off the tummy. And we've had some very, very good feedback from the reflux support group on that. So generally it's just huge peace of mind, I think, for people. That's the biggest thing that I am told by other mothers and grandmothers, just the peace of mind that it's given them.
Yes, and I know that the advice is that if babies spill, as they do with reflux, that they will spontaneously swallow it down, and I do think that that's probably true, 99% of the time, so long as it's a relatively small amount of spilling. But it makes parents feel very insecure when their babies are having quite large spills, and they feel very anxious about that. And
so it's a nice choice to have, to put them in the recovery position.
Yes, yes.
And how did you position your baby when it was wee? Because you didn't want the head shape and you didn't want her on the tummy. Did you make sure that the shoulder and the arm were forward?
Yes.
And that little leg was over? Right. And
I'll just actually show you that. So the baby goes on its side this way. The lower arm is forward. And there we go.
And sometimes you'd wrap a nappy up maybe in the back?
Yes, I usually used to put a support down through the back, a rolled up towel or a rolled up nappy, just to give it a little bit of extra support there.
And sometimes that knee over,
forward.
Yeah.
And
and then a nice big tuck under sheet, big tuck under air cell blanket preferably. Give it a tug and the baby can kick away.
Yes.
Do everything it's developmentally ready to do. The only things they then aren't able to do is end up with a funny shaped head and
or on their tummy.
On their tummy.
Indeed.
And the feet to foot is a concern of mine, because I happen to have personally met 4 mums and 3 have lost their babies after doing that, and they've used that as a lever with their feet.
Yes,
and they've ended up that way. And the eldest was 12.5 months.
Right.
And an older baby, which a lot of people aren't picking up, is able to turn freely right round inside the tube. I taught my 3 children how to do that at about 8-9 months, when the really high risk of SIDS is over.
Yes.
And then they can sleep in their desired sleep position, which is wonderful. And they don't know any different than I've got a little singlet on, and yet they can't roll off a bed.
Yes.
It's at the moment it's very fashionable for people to use sleeping bags, and some people use sleeping bags in conjunction with the safety sleep. In the winter that would be nice and cosy. A sleeping bag on its own, I think, is quite a nice choice, and I think, I don't know what you think, but that physiologically it probably reduce the likelihood of babies being able to do some things. But they can still turn on their face. Yes. They can still creep and end up with their heads locked and cut off the airway. And they can also stand and topple, because I've nursed them where they've hit the back of their heads and their foreheads on the cots, and they can still roll off a bed. So while they're lovely products, I still think that that's a necessary item for all the safety reasons. I don't know if you agree with that.
Oh, I think it's great. I was very happy with it.
Thank you very much. Is there anything
I'm happy to recommend them for the kids that I see.
Thank you.
And I do think that children adapt to them and actually come to like them very much the earlier they're applied.
Yes,
it's always harder trying to change a child's habits 6 or 8 or 10 months down the line. But if you can start the way you want to go on, it seems to work really well.
Yeah, it does work better the younger you introduce it. We have had some very happy success stories with older babies using education through play.
Yep.
Where we actually use it favourite teddy or something like that, and we don't actually put it on the child, we just say, look how lucky you are, and Teddy loves it, and it means Teddy can't fall out of bed, and the children usually end up really liking it. At 1 2-year-old, the parents wanted to go to South Africa and travel and not cart a portable cot around, and they used a teddy and let him put it on and off. So he had control, and then he said, "Me a turn," and the mother said, "Just a little one." She was teasing him into it, and he just did it himself, and that worked very, very well. And an hour and a half I spent once with a dad who said, "You think I'm the worst father in the world. I feel like throwing this kid against the wall. My wife's walking around crying, she's so tired, I can't concentrate at work. This child comes out of bed 16 times a night." And I said, "Well, it's not designed as a restraint, so I suggest that you do education through play." He rang me the next morning and he said, "Look, you spent an hour and a half with me. We so appreciate what you tried to teach us, but we're so desperate, we went cold turkey." And he said, "You won't believe it, but he slept through the night for the first time ever." So
he was
I think
sleep-deprived too.
some babies
Yes.
actually like that feeling
Snug feeling.
of being held, and that is what it feels like without having everything
Yes.
covered, and you're still quite free.
Yes.
Well,
Well, it was certainly quite dramatic without us at 4.5 months, going from waking 5-6 times a night to maybe once genuinely for a feed.
Mm. Well, thank you, Teresa Ferguson,
Mary.
the wonderful midwife, for coming and talking to us.
It's fine.
And Dr. Tristan de Chalain, craniofacial plastic surgeon. Thank you so much for all your information and your recommendation and your support.
Anytime.
Thanks, Marianne.